A single dad just wanted a safe home for his son, but when the landlord turned them away for being too poor, he didn't know the woman watching from the shadows was the landlord's billionaire daughter, and she was about to change everything. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment where in the world you are watching from. The key felt cold in Alex's hand, colder than the biting November wind that whipped around the corner of the brick building, carrying with it the scent of damp leaves and distant rain. He stared at the polished oak door, the number 3B gleaming in a brass oval that seemed to mock the worn-out state of his own life. This was it. The last stop on a list of maybes that had dwindled down to a single, desperate hope. Behind him, his son, Leo, kicked at a loose piece of gravel, his small form bundled in a blue jacket that was a size too big, a hand-me-down from a cousin who'd outgrown it last winter. Leo was 7, but he had the quiet, watchful eyes of a much older soul, eyes that had seen too many moving boxes and too many of his father's tight, forced smiles. "Is this the one, Dad?" Leo asked, his voice a small puff of white in the frigid air. Alex turned and managed a genuine smile, the kind reserved only for his son. "This is the one, buddy." 2 bedrooms, a park across the street, and a landlord who supposedly fixes things when they break, a real unicorn. Leo's face lit up, a small, brilliant sun in the gray afternoon. The thought of his own room, a space that wasn't a corner of a cramped living room, was a kind of magic he'd only ever heard about in stories. Alex's heart clenched. He wanted this for Leo, more than he'd ever wanted anything for himself. He wanted to give him walls that felt permanent, a window that looked out onto the same view every morning, the simple, grounding gift of a home. He straightened his shoulders, pulling his thin denim jacket tighter. It wasn't enough for the cold, but it was all he had. He'd spent the last of his savings on the security deposit and first month's rent, the cash folded into a neat, worn envelope in his pocket. It had left him with next to nothing, but the thought of Leo's own room made the risk feel like an investment. He pushed the heavy door open, the scent of lemon polish and old, quiet money greeting them. The lobby was immaculate, sterile, with a marble floor that reflected their scuffed boots and a silence that felt heavy, judgmental. A man sat behind a large mahogany desk, his back to them, speaking into a phone in a low, clipped tone. He didn't turn around. Alex cleared his throat, guiding Leo to stand beside him. "Excuse me," he said, his voice sounding rougher than he intended in the quiet space. "We have a 3 o'clock appointment to sign the lease for 3B. The man at the desk, Mr. Harrison, finally swiveled in his leather chair. He was older, with silver hair combed back with a rigid precision and a suit that probably cost more than Alex's truck. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, scanned Alex from head to toe, lingering on the faded knees of his jeans, the paint flecks on his boots, the calluses on his knuckles. The gaze was swift, dismissive, an entire financial background check completed in under 3 seconds. His expression didn't change, but a chill that had nothing to do with the weather settled over Alex. "Morgan," the landlord said, his voice as sharp and cold as his stare. He gestured to the 2 chairs in front of his desk, but it wasn't an invitation, it was a command. They sat, Leo's small hand finding Alex's and gripping it tightly. The silence stretched, filled only by the quiet tick of a grandfather clock in the corner, each second a judgment. From a high window overlooking the lobby, a figure watched, half hidden by the heavy velvet curtain. She saw the man and his son enter, saw the hope in the boy's eyes and the quiet desperation in the father's posture. She saw her own father's cold assessment, a look she knew all too well, and she felt that old familiar knot tighten in her stomach, the one that always appeared when her world and the real world collided. Mr. Harrison tapped a manicured finger on the folder in front of him, the sound a sharp, impatient rhythm against the silence. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. His decision, Alex realized with a sinking feeling, had already been made the moment they walked through the door. "Alex Morgan," the landlord began, his tone dripping with a condescending professionalism. "I've reviewed your application." Alex nodded, trying to keep his expression neutral, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. Everything should be in order. I have the deposit and first month's rent right here." He reached for the envelope in his pocket, but Mr. Harrison held up a hand, a gesture that was both subtle and absolute. "It's not about the initial payment, Mr. Morgan. It's about sustainability. Your stated income, a self-employed carpenter, is inconsistent. This building has standards. We require tenants to have a certain financial stability, a predictable income stream. Freelance work, as I'm sure you understand, is anything but predictable." Each word was carefully chosen, a polite weapon designed to inflict maximum damage without leaving a visible mark. Alex felt his face flush. He had worked tirelessly, taking on any job, big or small, from custom cabinets for wealthy clients to fixing a rickety porch for an elderly neighbor. He paid his bills. He provided for his son, but on paper, to a man like this, he was a risk, a liability. "My work is solid," Alex said, his voice low and steady, fighting to keep the tremor out of it. "I've never missed a payment on anything in my life. I have a list of references, clients who can attest to my reliability." Mr. Harrison offered a thin, dismissive smile. "References are about character, Mr. Morgan. This is about capital. They are not the same thing." Leo squeezed his hand harder, his small body tense. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He understood the coldness in the room. He leaned into his father's side, a silent act of solidarity that both broke Alex's heart and gave him the strength to keep his own from shattering. Alex looked the landlord straight in the eye, his pride a fragile shield against the man's casual cruelty. "I just want a safe place for my son to grow up." For a moment, something flickered in Mr. Harrison's eyes, not sympathy, but something colder. He leaned forward slightly. "And that's commendable. But a man's desire to provide for his family doesn't change the numbers on a credit report. Perhaps you should look for something more within your means. We have a reputation to maintain." The implication was clear. You don't belong here. People like you will bring the place down. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot wave that washed over Alex, leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. He stood up slowly, pulling Leo with him. He didn't say another word. There was nothing left to say. He turned his back on the polished desk, the ticking clock, and the man who had just dismantled his hope with a few carefully chosen sentences. As they walked toward the heavy oak door, Alex kept his eyes fixed forward, focusing on the scuffed toes of his son's boots. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Upstairs, the woman behind the curtain let it fall back into place, her hand trembling. She closed her eyes. The image of the father's quiet, wounded dignity and the boy's small, trusting hand burned into her mind. She heard the heavy thud of the lobby door closing, a sound of finality that echoed the hollowness in her own chest. Her father had done it again. He had reinforced the invisible walls that separated his world from everyone else's, and she, as always, was trapped on the inside, a silent, unwilling accomplice. The cold air hit them like a slap as they stepped back onto the street. The sky had darkened, the clouds hanging low and heavy, threatening a rain that felt more like an insult than a release. Alex walked with a stiff, forced stride, his hand still holding Leo's, his knuckles white. He didn't speak until they reached their old rusted truck, parked a block away. The silence was a chasm between them, filled with unspoken disappointment. "Dad?" Leo's voice was small, tentative. "Are we not getting the new house?" Alex stopped, his hand on the cold metal of the truck door. He knelt, turning Leo to face him, forcing his own expression to soften, to erase the sting of humiliation that was still so raw. He brushed a stray strand of hair from his son's forehead. "Not that one, buddy. Turns out, it had a plumbing problem, a big one. We wouldn't have been happy there." It was a clumsy lie, thin and transparent, but it was the only armor he could offer his son at that moment. Leo's brow furrowed, his young face a study in confusion. "But you said it was perfect." "I was wrong," Alex said, his voice thick. "Sometimes things look good from the outside, but they're not right for us. We'll find a better one. A real unicorn, remember? This one was just a horse with a party hat on." He tickled Leo's side. a desperate attempt to coax a smile, and was rewarded with a small, watery giggle. It was enough. He hugged his son tightly, burying his face in the boy's oversized jacket, inhaling the scent of laundry, soap, and innocence. For a moment, just a moment, he let the weight of the world rest on his shoulders, hidden from the one person he was determined to protect from it. They climbed into the truck, the engine groaning to life with a familiar, rattling cough. As they drove away, Alex glanced in the rearview mirror, the grand brick building shrinking in the distance, until it was just another part of a city that felt increasingly alien. He didn't see the sleek, black town car that pulled away from the curb moments later, following them from a discreet distance. Inside, Chloe Harrison sat in the plush leather seat, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice low and sharp. "Find out everything you can about him," she said to the person on the other end. "Alex Morgan, a carpenter, and find out discreetly. I don't want him to know he's being watched." She disconnected the call and leaned her head back, closing her eyes. She wasn't sure what she was doing, only that she couldn't let it go. It wasn't pity. Pity was what her father felt for the world outside his gilded cage. This was something else, something closer to recognition. In Alex's quiet defiance, in the fierce, protective love he had for his son, she had seen a kind of wealth her father would never understand. And in the casual cruelty of her father's dismissal, she had seen the very emptiness she was trying to escape. The system he had built, the one that judged a man by his bank account instead of his heart, was the same system that was slowly suffocating her. She wouldn't be a part of it. Not anymore. The workshop smelled of sawdust, linseed oil, and quiet solitude. It was Alex's sanctuary, a rented garage space at the edge of an industrial park, filled with the tools of his trade. Here the world made sense. Wood had grain, measurements were precise, and a well-made joint was a thing of honest beauty. For 2 days after the disastrous meeting with the landlord, Alex poured himself into his work, sanding, cutting, and joining pieces of reclaimed oak into a bookshelf for a client. The rhythmic scrape of the plane and the hum of the sander were a balm to his bruised pride, a way to sweat out the frustration and the lingering sting of failure. He hadn't told Leo the truth, sticking to the story of faulty plumbing, but Leo was perceptive. He was quieter, his drawings more subdued. The magic had dimmed, and Alex felt the weight of that dimming in his own soul. He was finishing the final coat of varnish on the bookshelf when the sound of expensive tires crunching on the gravel outside broke the silence. He glanced up, expecting a delivery truck, but instead saw the same black town car from the other day. He didn't recognize it, but a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. The door opened, and a woman stepped out. She was tall, dressed in simple but clearly expensive jeans, and a soft cashmere sweater, the color of cream. Her hair was tied back in a loose, elegant knot. It was the woman from the window, Chloe. He didn't know her name, of course, but he recognized the face, the posture, the aura of quiet privilege that seemed to cling to her like perfume. She approached the open garage door, her steps hesitant, her expression unreadable. "Excuse me," she said, her voice softer than he expected. "Are you Alex Morgan?" He wiped his hands on a rag, his stance immediately guarded. "Depends who's asking." She offered a small, tentative smile. "My name is Kate. I was given your name by a friend. I heard you're the best craftsman in the city." The lie was smooth, but her eyes betrayed her. There was a flicker of something in them, nervousness, maybe even guilt. Alex leaned against his workbench, arms crossed. "I'm just a guy with some tools. What do you need?" She gestured vaguely behind her. "I have a piece of furniture, an antique. It was damaged in a move. A family heirloom. I was hoping you could take a look at it." It was a classic setup, the kind he'd read about in books or seen in movies. The damsel in distress, the humble craftsman. But this felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was connected to the apartment, to the cold-eyed landlord. Maybe she was his assistant, sent to do some kind of follow-up, to offer a consolation prize. He wasn't interested in charity. "I'm pretty busy right now," he said, his tone flat. "I'm not taking on new projects." Chloe's smile faltered. Oh, I understand. It was my grandmother's. It means a lot to me. She let the words hang in the air, a carefully placed hook. She saw the hesitation in his eyes, the battle between his pride and his need for work. He glanced around his workshop, at the stack of unpaid bills on his desk, at the worn tires on his truck visible through the door. Leo's face flashed in his mind. He needed this job, whether he wanted it or not. He let out a slow breath, the fight going out of him. "All right," he said, the word tasting like defeat. "I'll take a look, but I make no promises." Chloe's relief was palpable, a subtle relaxing of her shoulders, a softening around her eyes. "Thank you," she said. Her voice filled with a gratitude that felt far too large for the situation. "I really appreciate it. When would be a good time to bring it by?" He looked her over one more time, the woman who called herself Kate, the woman with the sad eyes and the expensive sweater. He still didn't trust her, not for a second. But he would fix her furniture. He would take her money. And then, he hoped, he would never have to see her again. 3 days later, Alex found himself standing in a place that felt like another planet. Chloe, or Kate, as he knew her, had insisted he come to her, explaining that the piece was too fragile to move. She'd given him an address in a part of town he'd only ever driven through, a neighborhood of sprawling estates hidden behind stone walls and iron gates. He'd expected a large house, but not this. It was a guest house, she'd explained when he called from the gate. But the guest house was larger and more elegant than any home he'd ever been in. It was a modern box of glass and steel, nestled in a meticulously landscaped garden that overlooked the city skyline. The interior was minimalist and cool, all white walls, polished concrete floors, and furniture that looked more like art than something you would actually sit on. And in the center of the vast living room sat a small, ornate writing desk with one of its delicately carved legs snapped cleanly in two. It was a beautiful piece, clearly old and valuable. It was also, Alex noted with a craftsman's eye, a very clean break, almost too clean. "It happened during the move," Chloe said, hovering nearby, wringing her hands in a gesture of anxiety that felt slightly rehearsed. "The movers were careless. I was devastated." Alex ran his hand over the splintered wood, his touch gentle, reverent. "It's black walnut," he said, more to himself than to her. "Early 19th century, I'd guess. The joinery is incredible." He looked up at her, his suspicion momentarily overshadowed by his professional admiration. "This is a museum piece. You should have called a specialist, not a guy who fixes porches." Chloe shook her head, her gaze fixed on the broken leg. "I don't trust specialists. They're cold. They see the value, not the history. My friend said, you understand history, that you care." There it was again, the flattery, the carefully chosen words designed to appeal to his pride. He should have walked away. He should have told her he was out of his league. But he was already hooked, not by her story, but by the challenge of the work itself. This desk whispered a story of time and craftsmanship, and he wanted to be the one to help it speak again. He crouched down, examining the break more closely. "I can fix it," he said, his voice quiet. "But it will take time. I'll need to do it here. I can't risk moving it again. I'll need to match the wood, the age, the finish. It won't be cheap." He looked up, expecting her to negotiate, to question his price. Instead, she just nodded, her eyes wide with a relief that still felt out of proportion. "Whatever it takes," she said. "Just make it whole again." Leo had come with him, as he often did on jobs where Alex knew he'd be safe. He'd been quiet and wide-eyed since they'd passed through the gates, clutching his sketchbook to his chest like a shield. Now, he sat on the floor a few feet away, drawing the strange angular sculptures that dotted the room. Chloe noticed him, and her whole demeanor softened, the practiced anxiety melting away to reveal something genuine. "He's a wonderful artist," she said, her voice hushed. Alex glanced over at his son. "He's my whole world." The words were simple, unadorned, but they landed in the quiet, sterile room with a profound weight. Chloe looked from the boy to the father, and a look of deep, aching longing passed over her face, so quick that Alex almost missed it. In that moment, he saw past the expensive clothes and the rehearsed story. He saw a woman who was just as broken as the piece of furniture she wanted him to fix. The guest house became a temporary annex to Alex's workshop. He spent the next week there, working for hours each day, while Leo sat nearby, content to draw or read in the quiet, sun-filled space. Chloe was a constant but unobtrusive presence. She would bring them lunch-simple sandwiches and fruit, as if trying to match their humble world, and sit with them, asking Leo about his drawings or talking to Alex about the wood, the tools, the process. She was a good listener, her questions thoughtful, her interest seemingly genuine. Alex remained guarded, his conversations with her professional and to the point. He talked about dovetail joints and wood grain, about the patience required to match a century-old patina. He didn't talk about his life, his struggles, or the landlord who looked so much like her. It was an ache in his chest every time she smiled a certain way. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, his walls began to crack. He found himself looking forward to the simple lunches, to the sound of her soft laughter when Leo told a silly joke. He started noticing the small things, the way she'd tuck a stray piece of hair behind her ear when she was concentrating, the way her eyes would get a little sad when she thought no one was looking, the fact that she always wore the same simple silver bracelet and nothing else. One afternoon, as he was carefully applying the final coat of finish to the mended leg of the desk, Chloe spoke from the doorway. "You're an artist," she said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a statement of fact. Alex didn't look up from his work. "I'm a carpenter. Artists don't worry about making rent." "Maybe they should," she replied, stepping into the room. "Maybe the world would be better if we valued the people who create beautiful things more than the people who just sell them." He paused, his brush hovering over the wood. He finally looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the deep, weary truth in her eyes. "You sound like you know a lot about that." She gave a small, sad smile. "More than you know," Leo, who had been listening from his corner, piped up. "My dad's the best. He can fix anything." He held up his sketchbook, showing her a detailed drawing of Alex at his workbench, his face a mask of concentration, surrounded by tools that looked like extensions of his hands. Chloe walked over and knelt beside him, studying the drawing with a serious expression. "You're right, Leo," she said softly. "He can." She looked from the drawing to Alex, and their eyes met over the top of the sketchbook. The air in the room shifted, becoming charged with an unspoken understanding. It wasn't about the desk anymore. It had never really been about the desk. Alex felt a pull toward her, a dangerous, unfamiliar warmth that threatened to melt the icy caution he'd lived with for so long. He looked away first, back to the safety of his work, but the feeling lingered. He was in deeper than he wanted to be, and he had no idea how to get out. The desk was finished. It stood in the center of the room, whole and perfect, the scar on its leg so seamlessly mended that only a true expert would ever know it had been broken. Alex ran his hand over the smooth, polished surface one last time, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. This was what he did. He took broken things and made them strong again. If only he could do the same for his own life. Chloe stood beside him, her reflection a pale ghost in the gleaming wood. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's perfect. You didn't just fix it, you healed it." Alex shrugged, uncomfortable with the intensity of her praise. "It's a good piece of wood. It knew how to be whole. I just helped it remember." He began packing his tools, the familiar clink of metal against metal, a grounding sound in the too-quiet house. The job was done. It was time to go, to take the generous check she'd written him and walk back into his own world, leaving this strange, sterile paradise behind. But he found himself lingering, straightening his toolbox, wiping down a surface that was already clean. He didn't want to leave. The thought hit him with the force of an unexpected wave, knocking the air from his lungs. He had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythm of this place, to her gentle presence, to the way Leo's laughter filled the vast, empty rooms. He had started to feel something for this woman, this Kate, with her sad eyes and her carefully constructed story. It was foolish. It was dangerous. She was from a world he could never touch, and he was a man with nothing to offer but his 2 hands and a heart that was already stretched thin. "Stay for dinner," Chloe said, her voice soft, breaking the silence. It wasn't a question. "Leo's been asking all day. I bought pizza." Alex hesitated. His mind screamed at him to say no, to make a clean break. But his heart, a foolish, stubborn thing, ached with a different answer. He looked at Leo, who was already beaming, his face a perfect picture of hope. "Okay," Alex heard himself say. "Just for a little while." The pizza arrived in a plain cardboard box, a strange, mundane object in the midst of so much luxury. They ate it sitting on the floor, using paper towels for napkins. It was the most comfortable Alex had felt all week. With Leo there, the conversation was easy, full of chatter about school and superheroes and whether pineapple belonged on pizza, a debate Leo took very seriously. Chloe laughed freely, her guard completely down. She wasn't the poised, anxious woman who had hired him. She was just Kate, a woman with a surprisingly goofy laugh who let Leo build a fort out of expensive couch cushions. After dinner, once Leo had finally crashed on a pile of those cushions, a half-eaten slice of pizza still clutched in his hand, a different kind of quiet settled between them. Alex helped Chloe clean up, their hands brushing as they both reached for the same napkin. The air sparked. They both pulled back, a sudden, awkward tension filling the space. They stood in the kitchen, the city lights twinkling through the floor-to-ceiling windows like a blanket of fallen stars. "He adores you," Alex said, his voice low. "The feeling is mutual," Chloe replied, her gaze soft as she looked toward the sleeping boy. "You're a good father, Alex, the best I've ever seen. I'm just trying not to mess him up." "You're not," she said, turning to face him. "You're showing him what integrity looks like, what it means to be a man who builds things instead of breaking them." Her eyes were shining, and in their depths, he saw a vulnerability that mirrored his own. He took a step closer, drawn by a force he could no longer fight. She didn't move away. He could smell the faint scent of her perfume, something clean and green, like rain on fresh-cut grass. He lifted a hand, his calloused fingers gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. Her breath hitched. The space between them hummed with unspoken words, with the weight of a week's worth of shared glances and quiet lunches. It was the moment. The one where he could lean in, where he could find out if her lips were as soft as they looked. But he stopped. The face of the landlord, Mr. Harrison, flashed in his mind. The cold eyes, the dismissive smile. This was a fantasy, a beautiful, dangerous illusion. He dropped his hand, the moment shattering like glass. "I should go," he said, his voice rough. "It's late." He turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen, the city lights reflecting in her wide, heartbroken eyes. Alex couldn't shake the feeling. For days after finishing the job at the guest house, the memory of that almost kiss, of the look in her eyes, haunted him. He tried to bury it in his work, taking on a challenging project, building custom-fitted library shelves for a downtown law firm. The work required precision, focus, a steady hand. It was exactly what he needed to keep his mind from drifting back to her. He deposited her check, a sum far more generous than he'd quoted, and it had been a lifeline. It paid 2 months' rent on their tiny apartment, filled the fridge, and even allowed him to buy Leo a new pair of winter boots, the first pair he hadn't gotten second-hand. He should have been relieved, grateful. Instead, he felt a hollow ache, a sense of loss for something he'd never truly had. He hadn't heard from her since that night. He told himself it was for the best. They came from different universes. Any connection between them was bound to be a collision, and he was the one who would end up as wreckage. He had Leo to think about. He couldn't afford to get lost in a fairy tale. But Leo hadn't forgotten. "Are we going to see Kate again?" he'd asked one evening, looking up from a drawing of the guest house. Alex's chest tightened. "I don't think so, buddy. The job is done." "But I liked her," Leo said, his voice small. "She laughed at my jokes." "I know," Alex said, ruffling his son's hair. She was nice. That was the word he'd settled on. Nice. Safe. It was a lie. She was more than nice. She was captivating. And that's what made her so dangerous. The law firm, where he was installing the shelves, was in a tall, glass tower that scraped the sky, the kind of place that always made him feel small and out of place. He was on the 34th floor, working in a corner office, with a view that stretched for miles. He was sanding the final shelf, the scent of fresh-cut cedar filling the air, when one of the firm's partners, a man named Mr. Davies, walked in. He was an older, kinder man, who had admired Alex's work. "Incredible craftsmanship, Morgan," Davies said, running a hand over the smooth wood. "Truly incredible. You have a gift." "Thank you, sir," Alex replied, wiping dust from his hands. Davies leaned against the doorframe, a thoughtful look on his face. "You know, you remind me of another craftsman I know, a stubborn old fellow who believed in quality above all else, built an empire on it." Alex paused, a sense of unease creeping over him. "Oh yeah?" "Yes," Davies said, his eyes twinkling. "A man named Charles Harrison. You ever heard of Harrison Development?" The name hit Alex like a punch to the gut. Harrison, the landlord. The cold-eyed man who had dismissed him so easily. His blood ran cold. I've heard the name," he managed to say, his voice tight. Davies nodded, oblivious to Alex's inner turmoil. "A brilliant but ruthless man. His daughter is running things now mostly, Chloe. A sharp girl, but she has her mother's soft heart. She's been trying to steer the company in a more compassionate direction. Even has a little guest house on the Mason estate where she goes to hide from it all." The world tilted on its axis. Chloe, the guest house, the broken desk, the sad eyes. It all clicked into place, a horrifying, sickening puzzle. Kate was Chloe Harrison, the landlord's daughter. He felt like a fool, a complete and utter fool. He had been a project. A little charity case for the rich girl with a soft heart to fix, just like her grandmother's broken desk. The kindness, the lunches, the laughter, it was all a lie, a game. The warmth he'd felt for her curdled into a hot, bitter anger. He packed his tools with shaking hands, his mind reeling. He had to see her. He had to confront her. He had to look her in the eye and let her know that he wasn't some broken thing for her to pity and repair. The gates to the estate were closed, a formidable wall of black iron and stone. Alex stood before them, his heart pounding a furious rhythm against his ribs. He pressed the intercom button, his thumb jabbing at it with more force than necessary. A disembodied voice, smooth and professional, answered. "Yes? Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Chloe Harrison," Alex said, his voice tight, clipped. "My name is Alex Morgan." There was a pause, then the voice replied, "I'm sorry, sir, but Miss Harrison is not accepting visitors." The casual dismissal, the polite stonewalling, only fueled his anger. "You tell her I'm not leaving until I speak to her. You tell her the carpenter is here." He didn't know if the message would get through, but he stood his ground, a lone, stubborn figure against the imposing grandeur of her world. A few minutes later, the gate swung open silently. It wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. He drove his rusted truck up the long, winding driveway. The pristine landscaping and manicured lawns, a stark contrast to the chaotic turmoil in his chest. He parked beside a fountain that was larger than his entire apartment and got out, slamming the truck door with a satisfying thud. Chloe was waiting for him on the steps of the main house, a sprawling stone mansion that looked like it had been plucked from the English countryside. She wasn't wearing jeans and a sweater. She was dressed in a tailored black dress, her hair swept up perfectly, her posture regal. She looked like the woman on a magazine cover, a stranger. She looked like her father. "Alex," she began, her voice strained. "What are you doing here?" "I came to return this," he said, pulling the check she had given him from his pocket. He strode up the steps and held it out to her. "I don't want your money. I don't want your pity." Chloe flinched as if he'd slapped her. "It's not pity." "Isn't it?" he shot back, his voice rising. "What was I to you, Chloe? A little project? The poor, noble carpenter you could save to make yourself feel better about the world your father built? Was that broken desk even real? Or did you snap the leg yourself just to have an excuse to slum it for a week?" The words were cruel, and he knew it, but he couldn't stop them. The hurt was too deep. "No!" she cried, her composure finally cracking. "It wasn't like that. I wanted to help." "I didn't ask for your help," he yelled, the sound echoing in the cavernous entryway behind her. "I wanted a home for my son, and your father looked at me like I was something he'd scraped off his shoe, and you watched. You watched, and then you came to me with your lies and your sad story. Did you get a good laugh out of it, telling your rich friends about the gullible carpenter who fell for your act?" Tears welled in her eyes, but he felt no satisfaction, only a deeper, more profound ache. "It wasn't an act," she whispered, her voice breaking. "None of it was. Save it," he said, his voice dropping to a low, cold whisper. He dropped the check at her feet. It fluttered on the stone steps, a flimsy piece of paper that represented the vast, uncrossable chasm between them. "Stay away from me," he said, his voice hard, a wall of jagged ice. "And stay away from my son." He turned and walked away without looking back, the sound of his own heart breaking loud in his ears. He didn't see her sink onto the steps, her face in her hands, the sound of her sobs lost in the indifferent silence of the mansion. The workshop was no longer a sanctuary. It felt like a cage. Alex worked with a frantic, desperate energy, the rhythmic motions of his hands, the only thing that kept his mind from splintering. He took on more work than he could handle, staying late into the night, long after Leo was asleep, pushing his body to the point of exhaustion because it was the only way to silence the thoughts, the memories, the lingering image of Chloe's tear-streaked face. The anger hadn't faded. It had settled deep in his bones, a cold, heavy thing. He felt betrayed, not just by her deception, but by his own foolishness. He had let her in. He had let himself feel something, a flicker of hope that he might not be alone, that someone could see him, the real him, and not just the struggling single father. But she hadn't seen him. She had seen a project, a cause. He was a story she could tell herself, a way to assuage her guilt over the very privilege that had allowed her to waltz into his life in the first place. He told himself he was right to push her away, to protect himself, to protect Leo. But the victory felt hollow. Leo was the one who paid the price for Alex's wounded pride. He grew quieter, the light in his eyes dimming once more. He stopped asking about Kate, but her absence was a palpable presence in their tiny apartment. One evening, as Alex was tucking him into bed, Leo looked up at him, his small face serious. "Are you sad, Dad?" The question was a direct hit, a child's arrow piercing through all of Alex's carefully constructed defenses. "I'm okay, buddy," Alex lied, his voice rough. "Just tired." "You're always tired now," Leo said, his voice a quiet accusation. "You don't laugh anymore." He rolled over, turning his back to Alex, a small, heartbreaking gesture of retreat. Alex stood in the doorway of his son's room long after the boy's breathing had evened out into sleep. The silence of the apartment pressed in on him. He was protecting Leo, he told himself. He was keeping him safe from the inevitable heartbreak that came with people like the Harrisons. But as he looked at his son's small, sleeping form, a different, more painful truth began to surface. He wasn't protecting Leo, he was punishing Chloe. And in doing so, he was building walls around the one person he loved most, trapping him in a world made of his own anger and fear. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow. He had become the one thing he never wanted to be, a man who broke things, starting with his own son's heart. Chloe felt like a ghost in her own home. She moved through the vast, silent rooms of the mansion, the echo of her own footsteps her only companion. She had stopped going to the office, had canceled all her meetings, had ignored the incessant buzz of her phone. The world she had once commanded now felt like a foreign country, its language of profit margins and stock options a dialect she no longer understood. Her confrontation with Alex had shattered something inside her. His words, cruel and raw, had been a mirror, reflecting a truth she hadn't wanted to see. Had she been playing a part? Had her desire to help been a selfish act? A way to distance herself from her father's legacy of cold, calculated cruelty? She replayed every moment with him, every conversation, every shared smile. The memories were a torment, a mix of genuine warmth and the bitter taint of her deception. It hadn't been an act. Her feelings for him, for Leo, had been the most real thing she'd felt in years. She had been drawn to his integrity, his quiet strength, the simple, profound love he had for his son. She had wanted to be a part of their world, not as a wealthy benefactor, but as just Chloe. But he was right. She had lied. By omission, perhaps, but it was a lie nonetheless. She had hidden her identity, her connection to the very man who had hurt him, and in doing so, she had robbed him of his choice, his agency. He hadn't been able to choose to let her in, knowing who she was. She had made that choice for him, and that was a violation he could never forgive. Her father found her one afternoon in the library, staring out the window at the rain-streaked garden. He stood in the doorway, his presence filling the room with a familiar, oppressive weight. "You've been moping for a week," he said, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Whatever it is, get over it. We have a board meeting on Friday. You're expected to be there." She turned to face him, her eyes clear and cold. "I'm not going." His eyebrows shot up. "Excuse me?" "I'm done, Dad," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm done playing the part. I'm done being the face of a company that values profit over people, that judges a man's worth by the size of his bank account." A flicker of anger crossed his face. "This is about that carpenter, isn't it? I saw him leave. Good riddance. He was beneath you." "No," she said, a sad, weary smile touching her lips. "He wasn't beneath me. He was better than me. He was better than all of us." She walked past him, leaving him standing alone in the silent, book-lined room. She didn't know where she was going or what she would do, but she knew one thing for certain: she would not let her father's world define her anymore. She would not be a ghost in her own life. She would build something new, something real, something that a man like Alex Morgan could believe in. The building was a skeleton, a forgotten relic on a neglected corner of the city. It had once been a community theater, but for the last 2 decades it had stood empty, its windows boarded up, its brick facade crumbling. A monument to a time when people gathered for reasons other than commerce. This was where Chloe started. She bought the building with her own money, a quiet, off-market transaction that raised no eyebrows. She didn't want a headline, she wanted a foundation. She spent weeks with architects and city planners, not in a high-rise boardroom, but in a dusty, makeshift office she set up inside the derelict theater. Her vision was simple but radical. She wanted to create a space for people like Alex, a cooperative workshop for the city's artisans and craftspeople. It would be a place where they could share tools, resources, and knowledge, where they could build their own small businesses without the crushing weight of overhead and commercial rents. It wouldn't be a charity. It would be an investment in people, in skill, in the dying art of making things by hand. The project became her obsession. She was on site from dawn till dusk, dressed in jeans and work boots, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail. She learned about zoning laws and building codes, about load-bearing walls and electrical wiring. She was no longer a CEO delegating from on high. She was a builder, getting her hands dirty, creating something from the ground up. She never contacted Alex. She knew he would reject any direct offer from her. His pride was a fortress, and she had no right to breach its walls. But she made sure the news of the project reached him. She hired Mr. Davies, the kind lawyer from the firm where Alex had worked, to head the foundation's outreach program. She knew Davies had respected Alex's work, and she trusted him to approach Alex not as a beneficiary but as a potential partner. The plan was to offer him the position of workshop manager, a role he would have to apply for, a role he would earn on his own merit. It was a gamble. He might see through it. He might reject it out of principle. But it was the only way she could think of to offer him a hand without making him feel like he was being handed a lifeline. It was an apology written in blueprints and mortar, a testament to the fact that she had listened, that she had understood. She wasn't trying to fix his life. She was trying to build a world where a man like him didn't need fixing, a world where his worth was self-evident, a world where he could finally, truly, belong. She stood one evening on the dusty stage of the old theater, the ghost light casting a single, lonely glow. She looked out at the empty seats, imagining them filled not with an audience, but with the quiet, focused energy of creation. This was her atonement. This was her hope. This was the only way she knew how to say, "I'm sorry." Alex first heard about the Artisans Co-op from a flyer tacked to the bulletin board at his local lumber yard. "A new space for makers," the headline read, with a simple, elegant logo of a hand holding a hammer. The text described a new, non-profit workshop, offering affordable studio space and access to high-end equipment. It sounded too good to be true. In his experience, things that sounded too good to be true usually were. He ignored it. But then he started hearing whispers from other carpenters, from potters and metalworkers he knew. The project was real. It was well-funded, professionally managed, and the application process was rigorous but fair. They were looking for skilled artisans to be founding members, and they were looking for a workshop manager. The salary listed for the manager position was more than he'd made in the last year. It was a chance, a real one, to build something stable, to finally give Leo the life he deserved. But a knot of suspicion coiled in his gut. It felt too convenient, too perfect. He couldn't shake the feeling that Chloe was behind it. He imagined her pulling strings from her mansion, orchestrating this elaborate gesture to soothe her conscience. The thought made his blood boil. He would not be her puppet. He would not be her redemption story. He was about to rip the flyer from the board and throw it in the trash when he saw a familiar name at the bottom. For more information, contact Program Director, Mr. Davies. Davies, the lawyer who had admired his work, a man of integrity, a man who wouldn't be involved in something that was just a rich girl's vanity project. The knot of suspicion loosened, replaced by a flicker of cautious curiosity. That night, as he sat at his small kitchen table staring at the flyer, Leo padded out of his room, his sketchbook in hand. He climbed into Alex's lap and opened it to a new drawing. It was a picture of the three of them, him, Alex, and Chloe sitting on the floor of the Seine guest house, eating pizza. In the drawing, they were all smiling. "I miss her," Leo said, his voice a soft murmur against Alex's chest. "She made you laugh, Dad." The simple, honest words were a gut punch. Alex looked from his son's drawing to the flyer on the table. He had been so consumed by his own wounded pride, his own anger, that he had forgotten what mattered. He had forgotten the easy laughter, the shared meals, the feeling of not being so alone. Maybe he had been wrong. Maybe her kindness hadn't been a lie. Maybe the lie was the one he was telling himself, that he was better off alone, that his pride was more important than his son's happiness, more important than his own. He took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with something that felt, for the first time in a long time, like hope. He picked up the phone and dialed the number on the flyer. He wasn't doing it for her. He was doing it for Leo. He was doing it for himself. He was done letting his past dictate his future. It was time to build something new. The interview was less of an interview and more of a conversation. Alex sat across from Mr. WW.com. Davies in a temporary office set up amidst the dust and chaos of the theater's renovation. The air hummed with the sound of saws and hammers, a symphony of creation that resonated deep in Alex's soul. He had been nervous walking in, his portfolio of work clutched in his hand, his answers to potential questions rehearsed in his head. But Davies put him at ease immediately. They didn't talk about his financial history or his employment gaps. They talked about wood. They talked about the lost art of hand-cut joinery, about the beauty of a perfectly balanced tool. Davies asked him about his philosophy of craftsmanship, about how he would manage a space filled with strong-willed creative people. Alex found himself speaking openly, passionately, his love for his craft shining through. He laid out his ideas for the workshop, a mentorship program for young apprentices, a shared system for sourcing sustainable materials, a gallery space to showcase the members' work. Davies listened intently, nodding, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You're the man for the job, Alex," he said finally, closing the portfolio. "The board will need to approve it, of course, but as far as I'm concerned, the position is yours if you want it." Alex was stunned. He had expected more questions, more scrutiny, a background check. He hadn't expected it to be this easy. "The board?" he asked, a flicker of his old suspicion returning. "Who is on the board?" Davies hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "It's a group of local business leaders, philanthropists, people who believe in this city's artistic community." He was being evasive. Alex knew it. But he also knew, looking into the older man's kind, honest eyes, that Davies believed in this project, that he believed in Alex. And for now, that had to be enough. He accepted the position. He walked out of the old theater and into the bright afternoon sun, a sense of disbelief warring with a profound, bone-deep relief. He had a job. A real, stable, meaningful job. He could finally give Leo that room of his own, that life without the constant, gnawing anxiety of not knowing if they would make rent. He drove to the school to pick up Leo, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He found his son on the playground, sitting alone on a swing, his head down. Alex's heart sank. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice soft. "What's wrong?" Leo looked up, his eyes red, rimmed. "Some kids were making fun of me," he mumbled. "They said they saw your picture on the internet, with the fancy lady. They said you were poor, and she was your rich girlfriend, and you got dumped." The words, so cruel and childish, were a fresh stab of pain. The world had found them after all, its casual cruelty trickling down to the one person he had tried so desperately to shield. He knelt in front of the swing, his hands on his son's small knees. "You listen to me," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "What those kids say doesn't matter. Your dad is not poor. I'm the richest man in the world because I have you. And that lady, she was my friend. And sometimes, friends make mistakes. But that doesn't mean the friendship wasn't real." He looked at his son's sad, confused face. And he knew what he had to do. He had to stop running from the past. He had to stop letting his pride build walls. He had to face Chloe, not with anger, but with the truth. For Leo, for himself. Because their story, however messy and complicated, was real. And it wasn't over. He found her at the workshop. He wasn't surprised. It felt like her sanctuary, just as his own small garage had been his. She was standing in the middle of the cavernous main room, talking to a foreman, a set of blueprints spread out on the cavernous brace. A makeshift table. She was wearing the same work boots and dusty jeans he'd seen her in before, her hair pulled back, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She looked tired, but she also looked alive, more real and vibrant than she ever had in the sterile elegance of her guest house. She saw him and froze, her conversation with the foreman faltering. She excused herself and walked toward him, her steps slow, cautious. Her eyes were wide, searching his face for anger, for accusation. She found none. "Alex," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "what are you doing here?" "I got the job," he said simply. A flicker of relief, so profound it was almost painful, crossed her face. "I know. I mean, I hoped you would. You were the most qualified." "Was I?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Or was this another one of your interventions?" She flinched, the word landing like a small, sharp stone. "No," she said, her voice pleading. "I just created the opportunity. You earned it, Alex. All on your own. I knew you would." He believed her. He didn't know why, but he did. He looked around the space, at the raw wood and exposed brick, at the framework of what would one day be a place of creation and hope. "This is incredible, Chloe, what you're doing here." "I wanted to build something that mattered," she said, her gaze drifting around the room. "Something that wasn't just about making money. Something that you would respect." They stood in a pocket of silence, the noise of construction buzzing around them like a distant hum. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with months of anger and misunderstanding, and a deep, unyielding ache. "Leo misses you," he said finally, the words catching in his throat. Her eyes filled with tears. "I miss him too," she whispered. "I miss both of you. Every day." He took a step closer, closing the space between them. The kids at his school saw the news articles. The gossip. They were cruel to him. Chloe's face crumpled, a look of pure anguish washing over her. "Oh, Alex, I'm so sorry. That's what I was afraid of. That's why I stayed away." "I know," he said, his voice soft. "But staying away didn't fix it. It just left a hole. I told him. I told him we were friends, and that sometimes friends make mistakes." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Are we, Alex? Are we still friends?" He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before his fingers gently brushed her cheek, wiping away a single tear. "I think," he said, his voice low and rough, "we were always more than that." The touch was electric, a current of forgiveness and longing that arced between them, melting the last of the icy walls around his heart. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, a soft sigh escaping her lips. It was a surrender, a homecoming. In the middle of the dust and noise and the beautiful, unfinished mess of what they were building, they finally found their way back to each other. The ending wasn't an ending. It was a beginning, written not in headlines or on bank statements, but in the quiet, unshakable truth of a second chance.